Welcome to the Worth Knowing live stream on my Substack, Worth Knowing with Matt Robison, and we're on Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, LinkedIn, and of course on YouTube, twice in both portrait and landscape mode, which I guess means you could watch us sitting up or lying down. On today's Worth Knowing, how much we don't know, President Trump's attack on Venezuela and extraction of President Nicolas Maduro has dominated the headlines for the past 72 hours, and yet there's still so much we really don't know about what's really going on here. And I wrote about this on Substack yesterday in a piece called Four Looming Questions That Will Decide Whether Trump's Venezuela Attack Ends in Victory or Disaster. And what I want to do today is spend just a few minutes running down some of the possibilities for what's really going on. And then we're going to bring on today's guest, Jonathan Larsen, who's a veteran of CNN and MSNBC and Air America, The Daily Show. He created Up with Chris Hayes. He wrote for Countdown with Keith Olbermann. He was part of the original Moon program. He's done a lot of important things, including his original reporting on the backstory of what's going on, some of the missing pieces of the puzzle. So I hope what will emerge from today is a better understanding of what Donald Rumsfeld might have called the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. So let's start with four potential explanations of what drove Trump's decision to launch this attack. And let me just quickly say, as we get into this, hello to everyone in the chats. And I hope that you will feel free to lob questions and theories and ideas at me and Jonathan as we get into this. So look, explanation number one is sort of the simplest paint by numbers one. This was about the drug case against Maduro. There's not nothing to this. It's not entirely without merit. I mean, this is what they cited, the administration, as the initial legal justification. And there is a so-called talking indictment, a very detailed 30-page indictment of Maduro that does lay out a case that he is the leader of the Cartel de los Soles, which I'm mispronouncing. Sorry. Yo no hablo español muy bien. And Secretary of State of the United States of America, Marco Rubio, did frame the operation as a law enforcement action. But that's about as much as I can say for this. I mean, for one thing, this is a case that is going to string out for years and years. The judge in the case is 92 years old. And simply demographically, it's unlikely that this judge is going to see this case through to its conclusion. There are going to be interruptions. Jury selection is probably at least a year away. And then there are going to be endless appeals. The point is, it's useless as a form of near-term political validation for all of this. They must have known that going into it. That makes it flimsy on its face. But then you get the fact that right after Rubio gave that justification, Trump immediately undercut it, as he is wont to do, by saying this was about the oil, and Rubio himself, after saying it was a law enforcement operation, said Nicolas Maduro had multiple opportunities to avoid this. He was provided multiple very, very, very generous offers and chose instead to act like a wild man. So wait, explain this to me like a 2-year-old. If Maduro had given Trump what he wanted on oil or something else, he could have literally gotten a get out of jail free card. I mean, was this executing an arrest warrant or wasn't it? If you got an arrest warrant, it's not like, well, come out of that bank. We're going to arrest you, release the hostages, unless you give us some of the money. That's not how this works. Not to mention that Trump pardoned former Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez, accused and convicted of very similar drug crimes to what is being accused against Maduro here. This does not hold any water. And Trump has basically stopped pretending that it does over the last 48 hours. It's just, I mean, this is, to be clear, they needed to mouth all of this because drug trafficking and this arrest is one of the few domestic legal hooks that they could use to make this operation legal. They're leaning on the federal government's legal authority to deploy the military to protect federal operations and personnel. So they had to say this, but it's not, this is not it. This is not it. All right. Number two, this was all about access to the oil. Well, I mean, That seems more likely. That's certainly what Trump has sort of said the quiet part out loud about over the last couple of days. And administration officials have reached out to oil executives to say, prepare for reinvestment. That sounds pleasant. They, by the way, have said, maybe not. But I mean, this would be kind of a typical transactional, avaricious, oh, look, oil type of thing for Trump, except here's what doesn't add up about it. Industry experts estimate that it's going to take nearly a decade and $100 billion, insert pinky in corner of mouth, $100 billion to raise production from the current 1 million barrels per day to 4 million barrels per day. That net increase would be 3 million barrels a day. I know I said there would be no math, but well, here you go.
Nerd alert!
It was my understanding that there would be no math.
I don't even know what that means.
No one knows what it means, but it's provocative.
And this math is pretty easy, right? 3 million additional barrels. Guess what? By this year, we're supposed to worldwide, we're projected to produce 107 million barrels per day. So that's less than a 3% increase. So the idea that, oh, this was all about lowering oil prices, maybe there's an affordability piece to this. No, I mean, American consumers aren't going to get any benefit from this anytime short of 10 years from now. And it's going to be minute, extremely minute, if it ever occurs. Maybe there's an aspect of this. Oh, it's payback to the oil companies who did support Trump in his campaign. They're all buds of his. But again, the background reporting here is that the oil companies think this is entirely sketchy. They are not that excited about this prospect. So this doesn't totally wash for me either. Well, then there's the wag the dog explanation, number 3. Maybe this was all a political distraction. Maybe this was, his poll numbers are tanking. There's the Epstein files. And you have a former senior administration official telling Politico on background, they're still very tied in. This isn't like an unhappy former member, telling Politico on background that this happened because Trump, quote, needed a victory amid tough headlines. And there is something to this. We know Trump has a pattern of kind of the rotating credit card debt theory of politics. It's like you run into problems here, just like rotate it over here and like move to a new topic that is even bigger and splashier and more problematic. So sure, maybe, except that doesn't really wash for me either, especially given what we know about public opinion on all of this. In September, a YouGov poll found just 16% support for a U.S. invasion of Venezuela, 62% opposed. By December, guess what? Quinnipiac, same results. U.S. military action inside Venezuela, 25% support, 53% opposed. So, I mean, sure, you could distract by lighting yourself on fire politically, but this doesn't seem to be it to me either, but maybe. Finally, let's get to number 4, because this is what links to our guest today, or maybe there's a lot more that links to our guest today. Maybe there's no plan. Maybe this is just Trump's whims. I mean, clearly there was no plan for day after. You saw this in the initial Mar-a-Lago press conference, where Trump immediately undercut everything that Rubio and Hegseth were saying. He immediately contradicted himself about who would run the country. It seems like they're kind of making this up as they go along, except let's not forget that this took months of planning. There was months of run-up, significant military assets. This wasn't wake up in the middle of the night and post on Truth Social. This was a major operation planned for a long, long time. But there's a component of this that maybe ties in, because there's a classic book in political science called Essence of Decision that says there are different ways of understanding what's driving a country's behavior. And one of the models that they suggest is that in any government, There are competing voices, competing power structures, different agendas. Maybe that's part of it. Maybe this was kind of a no coherent plan thing because there wasn't one plan. There were multiple plans going on. Maybe that's part of it. Let's bring in an expert on all of this, including some of the hidden agendas going on behind the scenes. Jonathan Larsen, welcome back.
Thanks, Matt. Good to be here. I'm not sure anyone on the planet counts as an expert in all the various things you've just said, but I'll do my best.
I think that's a good place to start. I think this is like what did Plato say? The only wisdom. Oh no, it was Socrates. The only thing worth knowing is that you know nothing. And you know some things, and maybe this is a Murder on the Orient Express spoiler alert situation where maybe all the suspects are guilty. Maybe it's a little bit of everything all at once. But let's start with one piece that you've talked about here before, but it's complicated. And I think it's worth understanding. Could you walk us through the original reporting that you did about a hidden agenda that's underway here behind the scenes that might be one of the drivers here?
Sure. So a lot of the information that the Trump administration has been getting even before he took office in his second term has come from two guys who were working outside of government. One's a former CIA officer named Gary Bernson. Another is a Venezuelan expatriate and dissident named Martin Rodil. And for at least 2 years, it seems, they've had the financial backing and the involvement, participation in their efforts of a guy named Patrick Byrne. People may remember him as the former Overstock.com CEO who became a well-known election denier. And for several months over the course of last year, I was reporting on the fact that Bernson and Rodil were making allegations, feeding allegations to the Trump administration, suggesting that Tren de Aragua, the criminal gang that we've heard so much about, was not just a criminal gang with disparate cells operating in various countries, but that they had been, that Maduro, former president, I guess we should say, Nicolas Maduro, had arranged for them to be trained, for hundreds of paramilitary Tren de Aragua members to be trained and then lead thousands of gang members into the U.S. to destabilize the country. This claim was part of, if people remember, the initial claim to extraordinary deportation powers under the Alien Enemies Act back in the late winter and the spring. That this assessment essentially arose from and was based on the claim coming from Bernson and Rodil about the sort of covert paramilitary invasion allegation about Tren de Aragua. And that sort of stuff continued and was part of the OLC, the Office of Legal Counsel at the Justice Department. They internally generated a memo over the summer saying this invasion stuff and Maduro's war against the US, that also justifies what the average layperson and any non-compromised lawyer would recognize as murder at sea, blowing up people without due process. So this narrative of a covert war waged by Maduro against the US has been a very real part of the legal structure underpinning the actions they've taken. Now, what I've revealed...
They seem to have bought this. This is part of what they're kind of not saying out loud behind the boat bombing campaign over the last few months.
Yeah, so it varies what they say, the administration leaders. It varies what they say publicly on Fox, in their legal filings. It varies a lot. And in fact, there was an indictment about another figure who I suspect we'll be hearing about in this case over the summer, which was, to me, very interesting because it did not allege this sort of coherent strategic scheme, right? And so it's pretty clear that there are elements within various agencies in the U.S. intelligence and law enforcement communities that feel different ways about all of this. What I discovered back in, I don't know, October or November, however, was that Rodil, in addition to Gary Bernson, it turns out both of them had also played a role which was not known at the time in the election denial efforts in 2020. I don't know if people remember Sidney Powell, the Trump legal team lawyer. She famously, virally went on TV and said, we're going to release the Kraken. And the Kraken turned out to be a Venezuelan military veteran who alleged that the election was stolen by Venezuela for Joe Biden. And it turned out Michael Isikoff and I forget the co-author, Michael Isikoff's co-author, and he, in a book a couple years ago, they revealed that it was Bernson who connected that witness, the Kraken witness, with the Trump legal team back in 2020, along with an unnamed partner who last year I revealed was Rodil. So the same two guys who have been feeding the Trump administration the narrative that Maduro is waging a covert war also turn out to have been key but undisclosed at the time figures in the attempt to convince not only the country, but Trump himself that Maduro stole the 2020 election. And so the theory kind of first advanced by national security reporter Seth Hatena is that on some level, Trump has bought this theory, and a part of what's driving the anti-Maduro campaign has been payback for 2020. And we haven't seen that officially, but there have been glimmers on social media of Trump not letting go of that narrative of the Venezuela stole 2020 narrative. In fact, I'm going to be doing some original reporting on my Substack, jonathanlarsen.substack.com, along these lines, connecting some of these dots that haven't yet been publicly connected. But The Guardian has also advanced some of my reporting. It's starting to get pickup and attention in the mainstream media, and hopefully, I've done my best trying to get Democratic comment, but hopefully we'll see some members of Congress stepping up and demanding not only information but consequences for if this intel has been allowed to supersede actual genuine intel in the process.
First of all, I'm just going to do this live on the show. I'm going to keep working on trying to get you a member of Congress to engage because this is important. And if people want to see your original reporting on this, and I know like members of Congress, it's like, believe me, I've worked for 4 of them. Like it's hard.
I have a lot of sympathy. I do. The time. I don't take it personally.
I do think this is going to get some traction. So I've splashed up on the screen the link to your Substack. And I believe this was your first story on this. We can put into the chat. No, not your first.
No, I've been writing about this since March.
Since March. Okay. You've been on this.
Yeah.
But this is the intel piece. You also wrote, just to pick up on one other thread, these same people, as you said, are still pushing 2020 election steal lies. And that's as recently as November, you were saying that this is getting ongoing traction inside the Trump administration.
Well, we do know that The Guardian reported, I believe in November, they were the first to sort of confirm a specific name. Seth Hatena, who I mentioned earlier, he reported earlier that that Bernson and Rodil were getting a hearing within the Trump administration. We didn't have a name yet. And then The Guardian in November said that the U.S. attorney for the District of Puerto Rico named them, was working with Bernson and Rodil. What remains unclear is what pieces of the Bernson-Rodil story are any of these people accepting and buying? Because again, like the indictment I mentioned last summer, as well as both the original Maduro indictment and the superseding indictment that we got over the weekend, both of those indictments are very, very restrained. They are not offering anything like the global conspiracy theories that we're seeing from Bernson and Rodil. So it very much remains unclear. I will note though that I had reason to believe that Bernson and Rodil were in Washington in early April of last year. And then over the summer, Patrick Byrne claimed in a public appearance on one of these right-wing interview shows that he goes on, he claimed that in the April 7th cabinet meeting, when Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, laid out a lot of this stuff, Byrne claimed that that had come from a meeting between the DNI's office and Rodil just in the days prior. Now, and Gabbard did say something very vague about election interference or rigging or something along those lines. So there's definitely some threads and some pieces, but as you alluded to in your introduction, there's a lot of players involved here within the Trump administration with a lot of different casus belli that they have reason to want to go to war with Venezuela. And it's probably impossible to know which ingredients in this stew that's getting collectively fed to Trump pushed him over the brink of saying, we're going to go in and we're going to get Maduro. For all we know, it was Machado not giving him the Nobel Prize or Maduro daring to dance at his recent public rallies. Like, we don't get to know that. And I don't think Trump is a strategic enough thinker for him himself to tell us, here's exactly the thought process I went through to get here.
Well, it's a mystery wrapped inside a riddle, wrapped inside an enigma, to quote Oliver Stone, Joe Pesci and Oliver Stone. And there is a kind of like JFK assassination conspiracy vibe to all of this, that there could have been, like Stone ended up saying, like, well, it was probably the Cubans and the military and who else? Russia and
I mean, if you want to talk about all the countries supposedly involved in these conspiracies, you got to include Serbia, you got to include China. The list definitely goes on. According to Bernstein and Rodil, Maduro and or Chavez, through their election machines, which allegedly include both Dominion and Smartmatic, have stolen elections in 71 countries plus Venezuela. So in theory, they've got people in dozens and dozens of countries involved in this to some extent. And where this all gets tricky is, it looks like, I would guess, based on what we've heard from Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, and Stephen Miller, Deputy White House Chief of Staff, it seems like they were both invested in the idea of preventing both China and Cuba, and maybe Russia to some extent, from having a stronghold in Venezuela. And the reality is that most of the individual data points that these guys are going to point to actually do have some basis in fact, right? We're learning now Cuba claims that dozens of their own officers were killed in the Saturday morning attack because they were there protecting Maduro. There are operational ties between those two countries, between their militaries, between their intelligence services. The question is how true is it that represents one sprawling octopus as opposed to disparate actors coordinating and sharing information on some things, but not so much on others? I suspect it's closer to the latter, and backing me up would be these indictments that we're seeing, which are not in any way alleging anything close to the sweeping conspiracy theories that these guys are alleging.
Part of my point in my article yesterday was to provide a little bit of an explanation, a justification, an absolution to media outlets and anti-Trump people. I'm not saying exclusively Democrats. I'm saying anti-Trump sane people, about the kind of confused, mealy-mouthed, legalistic mishmash that we've all collectively provided in response here. I very much agree with our mutual friend Cliff Schechter that it would be awfully nice for Democrats to speak with one voice more forcefully and more catchily immediately, and to really jump on this and call out the insane lies and bullshit around all of it.
And the illegality, one would hope.
The illegality, absolutely. And at the same time, I agree. And at the same time, my whole point was to try to acknowledge that there is a lot of unknown here. There is a lot of potential drivers going on. There's a lot we don't yet understand. And underlying all of it is an essential point that I think can easily get lost in all of this. I mean, Schumer kind of tried to say some of this. It's like, let's not forget that Nicolas Maduro is a very, very bad man. That really understates it. 15% of the population of Venezuela, which sits on one of the world's greatest reserves of oil, 15% of the population of Venezuela is right now in need of urgent food assistance, according to the World Food Program. 70% of the population is now living in poverty. There is mass food insecurity, disease, and emigration. Again, not my words. That's according to the World Food Program. And so there is a humanitarian case to be made here that the people of Venezuela kind of deserved this. They're being exploited by a despot, and they deserved to be liberated. And I don't think it's a great look for people to say, well, we stand against this. Now, it is a good look to say we don't approve of breaking the law or saying that the ends justify the means. But we do have to bear that in mind in kind of how we react to this. And I think that it's entirely possible. Here's where I want to go with you.
I was going to say, I don't want to derail this, but I disagree with most of what you just said.
Oh, go ahead, please. By all means.
I honestly do not want to derail it. So please.
No. Before I was about to put you on the spot, so you put me on the spot. Go ahead.
Well, I'm just going to say that a few things. One is, if those are the criteria for removing despots, then the to-do list was enormous and had any number of people ahead of Maduro on the line. But also, more to the point, even if you accept all of those premises, actually, before we get to stipulating that, Delcy Rodriguez, one of the vice president, who's now interim president, one of the reasons reportedly they were interested in her was because she's actually been effective in recent years in turning the Venezuelan economy around. The Venezuelan economy has been rebounding. And there's also a case to be made that some of the impediments to Venezuela's economic revival or return were the U.S. sanctions and UN sanctions. So, excuse me, not UN. I'm thinking of Iran now. But I think the bigger point would be, not to mention, by the way, the blockade now on sanctioned tankers. But the bigger point is none of that's relevant, right? When hopefully in the U.S., if police, same thing with the boat bombings that we've conducted, right? The issue isn't were they drug traffickers? The issue is the U.S. government does not have the lawful or moral right to do this. And to me, litigating whether the target was good or bad is dangerously muddying the waters and also potentially derailing the segment. So now I will shut up.
No. It's not derailing, because I think it's not at all. I hear where you're coming from, and I'm not suggesting by any means that we hand wave.
Let me finish. I just remembered my other point.
Go ahead, please.
I'm sorry. The other point is that if all of those bad things, changing all of those bad things were the goal, all they did was replace Maduro with his handpicked vice president, Diosdado Cabello, the interior minister who's responsible for some of the worst alleged civil rights abuses there. He was issuing statements on Saturday morning. So all of the people, the functionaries, the factions, the political factions, the generals who run segments of the government, everyone's still in place. All you did was take out the boss. The corporation, the structure is all still there. And there's no indication, other than, a few fig leaves from Delcy Rodriguez, there's no indication that they're going to turn around and start, kicking out China, cutting ties with Cuba, shutting down FARC and ELN and saying to the drug dealers, sorry, you can't come through here anymore from Colombia on the way to the U.S. There's no indication of fundamental change there. And by the way, we don't know yet to what extent Maduro was consciously a bad guy, or whether to some extent he had to tolerate some of this corruption in order not to get killed, right? So I think it's much more complicated. But my bigger point, before I interrupted you a second time, I apologize again, was simply that when government power does bad things, it's distracting and I think deleterious to the conversation, to the civic discourse, to start litigating, well, the guy they did it to was really bad. And I think that's a very problematic road to go down, which is why I derailed the conversation.
It's not derailing. What we're engaging in is what I like to call a quantum conversation. It's first, it's over here, and then it's over here, which is good. I don't believe it.
It's the weave.
I'm not a linear Newtonian physics kind of guy. To be clear, my point isn't that, well, maybe there is a legit justification and these guys are deep humanitarians who really care about the welfare of the Venezuelan people. My point is that from a political standpoint, as much as we all want Hakeem Jeffries to actually put together a coherent, political, compelling sentence rather than what he actually did say, I should actually read what he actually did say, because it is such a deep snooze fest. He said on the Sunday shows, pursuant to the Constitution, only Congress has the power to declare war, to authorize acts that take place in this regard. Oh, geez. Did that give you a political boner or what? As much as we want that, we also have to recognize the fact that what we're talking about is a war for the hearts and minds of the American people, to the extent that we're still in a democracy. And from a political standpoint, we can never lose sight of the fact that there is an element here of there is deep suffering. This guy is a despot. He is in bed with the Cubans. He is in bed with some bad people around the world. And we don't want to get on the side. We, the anti-Trump coalition of the sane, don't want to get on the side of saying like, well, you know, we're defending this guy. That's really my only point. And the other thing is, I don't think we want to over tilt on offering it. Well, it's all about the oil, because I'm not convinced that that is really the hidden agenda here. That seems to be in the mix. There seems to be some aspect of that. But I think the whole situation is a lot more complex. That's really what I'm getting across. And I just want to, while we're quantum conversationing this, I just want to acknowledge something that I think is kind of interesting going on in chats right now. I haven't been putting this up on the screen. I have a rule. I have a no trolls, no bots rule here. So trolls and bots are good friends. Jim Williams, Cynthia Rice do an excellent job of booting these people. However, people with dissenting opinions, pro-Trump opinions, just flat out disagreeing, saying I'm wrong, have at it. So there's an interesting back and forth going on. It's just not on topic here about was the 2020 election stolen? Do Fox News and Newsmax engage in propaganda? If people want to have that conversation respectfully, by all means, have at it. I have strong views on it, but I'm just not focusing on it. I just want to acknowledge that, because it's not like I'm banning you or like keeping you off the screen here. So okay, Jonathan, go ahead, please.
Wait, what do you mean go ahead? I
responded to you. I mean, I'm not defending Trump here. I'm just saying that, like, I think in the rush to, we've got to win the first 24-hour news cycle. We've got to come out and say, like, this was illegal. It was wrong. It was fucked up. It was all about oil. I'm like, well, yes, we can point out the fact that this was illegal, although under domestic law, it probably was legal. As the New York Times analysis showed.
Law.
Under domestic law. Now, under international law, which Pete Hegseth would probably say is like
Venezuela, especially not the crime. U.S. law doesn't apply in Venezuela, right? The law ends where the jurisdiction ends, and a lot of crimes are not even alleged to have taken place in the United States.
However, in protecting federal officers executing a warrant, that is the reason that they put forward, oh, this was all a drug bust, because there is legal precedent supporting that, not just in Panama in 1989, but that is one of the precedents.
Well, that may be the case. I'm not a legal expert. I don't know the history on Panama, but just because, first of all, I'm not aware that there was a warrant out for Maduro's arrest. I know he was indicted, but even if there is a warrant, I don't believe that takes precedence over the constitutional prohibitions against wielding military force against another country in another country. But I do agree with you that there was a debate to be had about Maduro and whether he should be there. And look, you didn't even mention another point in your favor, which they mentioned as well, which is the evidence that he stole his own election does seem pretty clear. It doesn't seem like he did it with Dominion or Smartmatic, but lots of international observers from a lot of other countries say, no, he's not the legitimate elected president of Venezuela. But to my mind, that debate should have been held before. And once the president of the United States illegally wields military power against another nation, at that point, the job of Congress is explicitly, you've sworn an oath to implement the job of Congress of being a check and balance, to defend and uphold the Constitution, not whatever laws Maduro might have broken, the Constitution. It is Congress's primary responsibility, sworn responsibility, to defend the Constitution, which prohibits the president from doing this. So what I actually didn't have too much of a problem with the quote that you read from Hakeem Jeffries, but the litmus test that I have for members of Congress when they talk is, I want to hear something from you that no one else can say except a member of Congress. If you get up there and what you say could have been said by a legal analyst, by someone on Twitter, then I didn't need you in Congress. What we need to hear from members of Congress is things only people in Congress can say, which is something like, this was illegal and I will therefore do X, Y, and Z.
Right.
Maybe it's articles of impeachment when we take control of the House again. Maybe it's going to be something like, I refuse to confirm a single nominee, which some Democrats voted for after this attack. I refuse to vote for a single military budget or nominee as long as the president and the civilian and military people in the chain of command responsible for these crimes are not being held accountable, and as long as the administration still has a sworn, an averred policy of being willing to commit these crimes going forward. That's what I want to hear from Congress. What can only you say?
I want to point out that the exchange that I was previously lightly praising for being non-trollish turned trollish. And thank you, Cynthia, for booting that person. Before he became trollish, moments later, he did call both of us idiots. Maybe me more than you, hopefully. I don't know.
I mean, I'm guilty on occasion.
Hank Tui 9037 says, you idiots, you don't remember Panama. I actually do remember Panama.
You just
very vividly.
Panama.
Yeah, we were just talking about it. And I would say to Hank, if you're still hanging around, or if you're a real human, that's one of my points here, is that there was a fascinating media study that I cited in my article that coverage of Panama, which was very selectively curated, that showed, thriving, happy people who were thrilled that Manuel Noriega was gone, did substantially change ex post facto U.S. public opinion. And there is a non-zero chance in this. And I will tell you, since we're talking about messaging and political positioning and members of Congress, I will tell you, having worked for a bunch of these guys, I know for a fact that the conversation that has gone on over the last 72 hours has been, hold on, let's not get too far out over our skis here. Because for one thing, as with all things Trump, there is a little bit of a trap involved here. To the extent that we believe that this is an intentional wag the dog distraction, let's not forget what we're distracting from. Let's not forget the obligation to explain the redactions that DOJ was supposed to have followed through on January 3rd. On the Epstein files. Let's not forget about the horrendous economic numbers and Trump's sagging approval ratings. Let's not forget that we've been talking for months about the fact that these boat bombings were probably partially intended as a distraction. How much do we want to lean into that? Especially, I'm just saying this is what the conversation was. I'm not justifying it. I'm just saying this is the way the conversation goes down with your communications director, which is like, how much do we want to lean into this? How much do we want to go to the mattresses on this point, especially when we don't know how the public is going to view this a month from now? We don't know if, Venezuelans seem to be doing better and the outcome is good, no matter how bad it is. I mean, I think Americans have shown that we'll put up with a little bit of mild to severe law breaking if the outcome is ultimately good. Voters tend to go with the ends justify the means. It is an unfortunate reality, and I'm not saying that we should condone it. I'm just saying that's what the conversation is. Let me get us onto a slightly related and different track. I set up at the beginning that I think there were multiple theories of what's going on. There's the drug theory, there's the oil theory, there's the wag the dog theory, there's the Model 3 behavior, multiple agendas going on in the administration theory. What grabs you in there? What elements of this do you think are kind of the biggest taste notes in this stew?
Well, I definitely am not a wag the dog type person. I know that tends to be most people's go-to. I have very little time or patience for it. You did not mention the election interference theory, which I do think merited attention all along, more than we knew until recently. And I think we'll get increasing attention as we go forward, especially with Trump continuing on social media to sort of wink, wink, wink in that direction. I think the drug angle is a real one and probably has been a driving factor all along, if only because that's been the heart of their legal case. And I do think that the oil is an issue, but I don't think it's an issue for Trump in the sort of strategic way that one might assume for a president. For one thing, if the objective is lower gas prices, that's a disincentive for every single American oil company to get involved in this, right? They don't want lower gas prices. In fact, the state of gas prices now, I guess just shy of $3 a gallon, that's not enough to spur even the domestic drilling that Trump wants to see, right? His campaign was incoherently self-contradictory. He said, we're going to drill, baby, drill, and we're going to have lower gas prices. Lower gas prices mean that you do not drill. Gas companies oil companies only drill when the price of gas is high enough that the profit margin justifies the investment. So it's a fairly incoherent argument, setting aside the morality of stealing a nation's natural resources. I do, however, suspect, based on the way Trump talks about it, that it is a reason for the Venezuela campaign in an emotional way. And by that, what I mean is, he's close to Harold Hamm of, I think, Continental Oil. He had that meeting with Big Oil last year, 2024, where he said, give me $1 billion and let me know what you want, or words to that effect. I do think he has spent more than one evening hearing an oil executive bitch and complain about efforts to nationalize the oil industry within Venezuela, which of course we hear from the Trump administration as they stole our oil, which of course no one mentions publicly, but the Washington Post did a great piece on last month, the history of it. There was a dictator in Venezuela literally 100 years ago who essentially gave away or sold for his benefit Venezuela's reserves, first to more than 100 foreign oil companies, which then sort of got winnowed down or osmosed into just 3 oil companies, including U.S. oil companies, who were essentially given vast access and the ability to exploit Venezuela's oil reserves. And so for decades since Gomez was in power, succeeding administrations in Venezuela, not starting with Chavez, well predating Chavez, have been trying to claw some of that back. And my guess is that on an emotional level, Trump has heard a lot of griping about that and is pissed off about it, has never heard the other side or even thought it through. And yeah, I would guess that to some extent that's what's been eating at him and driving him, especially when you think about China being able to buy all of that oil from Venezuela. So yeah, I do think those two things are pretty big up there. And the big mystery for me is how much of it is the election interference narrative getting traction with Trump.
I want to follow up on the oil point for just a second. I'm going to pop a comment up on the screen. I think this is interesting, even though it's a tiny bit trolly, but not. It's a legit point.
It's certainly within my allowed parameters.
Yeah, Daniel McDougall 8388 says, "Do I listen to the Venezuelan people who are celebrating, or listen to white liberals who just hate Trump?" Of course, I will not listen.
I do have an answer to that.
Yeah, go, please.
Of course. Now you took it down off the screen.
Yeah. Daniel, you went downhill after your first comment, which was intriguing.
Is a third group there that can be listened to. In fact, there are 4 groups of Venezuelans to be considered here. There are domestic Venezuelans who live in Venezuela and oppose or support the military action. And then there are expatriates who live in other countries for whatever reason. One reason to be somewhat distrustful of not this, I don't mean distrustful, but to view with some skepticism the view of Venezuelans in the US who, yes, are largely celebrating this, is that the group of Venezuelans who are in the US are a specific non-random sampling. These are people who either had the money to flee, right? So we're talking about rich Venezuelans, or were politically threatened by Maduro, so they have beef against Maduro, or they fled the country because things were genuinely terrible, and so therefore they might hate Maduro, or they might hate other countries for creating those conditions. There was polling, I forget who did it, there was polling done very soon, like right after the attack in Caracas, that showed that Venezuelans outside Venezuela, a majority, I believe it was, opposed the attack. Excuse me, supported the attack.
Right. But to that end,
but inside Venezuela, there were more opponents of the attack than supporters. And there is actually a potential reason for that, which is by decapitating the Maduro regime, you are potentially setting against each other the various factions that are held in check when there is one very clear power center.
Well, to your point, in Politico over the weekend, we have a quote: "If Venezuela does transition to democracy in the next few months," the word "if" is doing a lot of work in that sentence. But if, then Rubio will have achieved something so great that, in my opinion, would make him the greatest Secretary of State. That's Venezuelan GOP strategist Daniel DiMartino. And then he goes on to say the dominoes are going to fall in Cuba, Nicaragua, because Venezuela is going to achieve that. And I'm going to pair it with another quote that to me is one of the biggest issues in terms of public opinion is driving this, according to Eduardo Gamarra, an FIU professor who does polling in Florida. A lot of people think, well, here's a promise that the president made and that Rubio made, and he delivered. And the point is, this is all under the penumbra of reporting that's been done about Rubio's longstanding motivations here. He knows Florida politics like virtually no one else. He knows these communities, and he knows that there's kind of a community of common interest and affiliation here. Expatriate Nicaraguans, Cubans, and Venezuelans who basically think that they have the same issue that they're fundamentally dealing with, the same set of bad guys that they're against, and they see the fall of any of them as being directly responsive to something that's a very emotional understandably, very emotional problem for them. That is a driver here, potentially. This could be about a very influential voice in the Trump administration playing some very narrow parochial domestic politics and could, to your point, be highly influential here. And that delineation that you did, to the commenter's point, like, yes, you're going to see some celebration here. I don't think it's just white liberals. I'm going to disagree with you there, Daniel. I don't think it's just white liberals who are saying, like, this was illegal, risky, and there's a long history of the U.S. fucking things like this up and having it really rebound on us. I don't think that's like a white liberal comment. Shit, you have Tom Cotton. Let me read you Tom Cotton's comment on this. Like, this is not like some woke white liberal warrior. He is white. He said, I don't think we can count on Delcy Rodriguez to be friendly to the United States until she proves that Delcy Rodriguez and other sanctioned and indicted ministers in Venezuela were in league with Maduro until yesterday. I don't think we can count on them to be pro-American at all. There's a lot of skepticism coming here, right? So, like, but I do think
and there's a lot of MAGA skepticism about interventionism, period.
Absolutely. So what do you think about that domestic political angle here? Trump ran on ending nation building. Tulsi fucking Gabbard repeated herself ad nauseum like she was a broken metronome during the Democratic Party presidential debates, where she kept repeating, do you support this regime change war? Do you support this regime change war? Here's a regime change war. So what do you make of the MAGA politics of all of this and the Florida faction versus the broader issue?
Well, the folks I was telling you about earlier, including Patrick Byrne, the Overstock.com guy, I wrote an article on Saturday pointing out that in the months leading up to, in the latter half of 2025, these guys, Bernsen and Patrick Byrne especially, were warning that there were elements of the Trump administration that were pushing to install someone who was, in their words, cartel light. In other words, someone who would still, at a minimum, turn a blind eye to, but ultimately allow the cartels to continue to operate in Venezuela. Delcy Rodriguez and her brother, Jorge, the president of the National Assembly, those two were identified by Byrne as either spawns of evil or spawns of the devil, words to that effect. Delcy Rodriguez was supposedly the chief money launderer, the bookkeeper for the cartel / Maduro regime. And so as soon as we found out in that Saturday press conference by President Trump that Delcy Rodriguez was in fact going to be their point person in Caracas, I started looking at Patrick Byrne's Twitter feed to see what he had to say about this. And he's not calling her the spawn of evil or the devil anymore. Now it's more of a, well, Trump is so smart, and he almost always turns out to be right, so let's see what happens. So I think the folks who were ideologically opposed to interventionism, some of them are still out there, to their credit, saying, even if it's not boots on the ground for more than 2 hours, this is still a problem. Some of them are still saying that. But I think you probably have, totally guessing here, a faction larger than that that's saying, let's see what happens, right? They're very well trained to give Trump the benefit of the doubt. And of course, the reality is there is no final result, right? The final result of Venezuela will come with the heat death of the universe. We don't get to know how it works out.
No, it's going to happen well past Trump's expiration date, surely. And, look, this could be a case of, when we vote, we don't get to say how much we care. Like, your vote doesn't count double if you really feel strongly about something. This could be, as you said, a case of, look at the domestic politics of all of this. Like, the MAGA people, they'll do what we fucking say. Right? Like they will get in line like good little soldiers, and
a lot, but not all. Yeah.
A lot, but not all. But you're not going to lose that many MAGA voters in swing districts and states that count compared to what you'll gain with the expat Nicaraguans or descendants of expat Nicaraguans, Venezuelans, and Cubans in Florida. Maybe that's all the political justification you need.
Maybe, but I also think to some extent that that's a roll of the dice. Because those expats you're talking about, they are much less susceptible, I think, to the, well, let's give him the benefit of the doubt. If they've spent decades hating the Rodriguez siblings, and then they see that this whole big effort has just gone to install those two at the top of Venezuela, my guess is they're going to be pulling their hair out going, what the hell was all of this for? Because they know more. And the other possibility, I think, is the prospect I mentioned earlier of, and you saw this with Yugoslavia, right? When you take off the cap, right, that's been keeping everything in check, a lot of factions may now, even just purely defensively, to avoid getting taken down or wiped out, they may go on the offensive against each other. You've got all these gangs, they're called colectivos in Venezuela, that are deployed by the generals and the various leaders of the power centers in Venezuela. And then they're apparently, reportedly, they're out trying to assert control over whatever areas they have. And by the way, it's not even as if Maduro had ironclad control of his entire country. There's a good argument to be made that one of the reasons he was able to stay in power was because he didn't crack down too hard on those centers of power, on the border with Colombia, among other places. So the prisons, right? There was a big criminal faction where the gangs were controlling some of these prisons. So you've got a lot of power centers now that have been uncorked. And if, to your point about the domestic politics here in the U.S., if the country of Venezuela is assessed as having been slowly improving its situation and now plummets back down again because there's just rampant chaos, which most observers, I think, are going to see as considerably worse than whatever degree of despotism they saw in Maduro. That's potentially a political problem for Rubio, for Vance, and maybe in 2028, certainly, but potentially for Trump in 2026, depending on how fast and how badly things go.
Right. And just to kind of bring all of this full circle, what I wrote yesterday was a little bit of a mild, you see, you're never going to get very far with Democrats saying like, it's not that bad that we didn't jump in and like try to win the messaging war in the first 72 hours. Because of course we all want that immediately. They
should have been planting the seeds for months, but go ahead.
Right. But well, that is true. Look, I do think this is a marathon. I think, history, and we're seeing this in comments here, history is very instructive here. Even the case of George H.W. Bush, who did in the run up to the first Gulf War, did a tremendous amount of very professional. He had a team that did a tremendous amount of preparation, groundwork, setting the table in terms of preparing the American public for doing this, for making an actual compelling fact-based case for what we were going to do. Was it entirely right? I don't know, but I think in general, I remember at the time being fairly convinced that there was reasonable justification and there was an international coalition. There was all of that. They did all of that spade work and it worked. You can see it in the polling. It's in my article. If you go to worthknowing.substack.com, you can see that there was a huge move in public opinion in the run up to the first Gulf War. And then immediately afterwards, Bush achieved something like 90% approval ratings. And then he lost to Bill Clinton with a plurality, not even a majority. He lost to Bill Clinton just a year later. And so, look, if I had to put my hand on a crystal ball right now and make a prediction, which I'm not really going to do, but if I had to go one way on this, I think there's a lot of evidence, a lot of history to suggest that from Trump's standpoint, from our parochial domestic political standpoint, this is going to go very badly for Trump in the next 3 months. Am I confident about that? No. Do I, from a humanitarian standpoint, want it to go badly? No, I think I'm obligated to want this to go well. I want Venezuelans to stop suffering so much. But I think it is likely not, if this was a wag the dog distraction, if this were an oil grab, even just from a legal standpoint, I don't think any of the agendas going on here are likely to go well. And so that's what I'm seeing up ahead. Speaking of things that are up ahead, for people who are intrigued, who feel like Flutterby Dragon feels, love the fucking news, by the way, offers Flutterby. You mentioned what you're working on before. Tell us what's coming up.
Well, not too much, but the there has been a little bit of reporting on this. The New York Times had a really good piece, although I think they oversold it a little bit yesterday. They went in the same direction I've been going, which is that the new indictment, the superseding indictment, does not bear out the political claims that we've seen Rubio especially and Trump make about the cartel activity and the nature of the government in Venezuela. It does not say Maduro was the head of any cartel. And that is an extraordinary, I think, walk back, especially from an inarguably compromised Justice Department. But I'm hoping to go even further, because all of the charges against Maduro, in theory, are going to require evidence, right? That's how our courts still work. And the question people should be asking now is, what is that evidence? And there are basically two forms of evidence that we can expect to learn about. One is documentary evidence, which, by the way, given the nature of the institutions we're talking about, will probably need to be validated or verified by the other form of evidence, which is witnesses. They need to have someone credible to say, yes, that document is real. They're also going to be getting a lot of the allegations against Maduro and his co-defendants in there from specific witnesses. And not only are there potential minefields for the prosecution case against Maduro and his co-defendants, but there is the very strong possibility, given the discovery process where the government has to share its internal documentation and evidence, that this is going to rip the lid off a lot of the sort of machinations and external intel sourcing that I've been talking about. Because I don't think I mentioned this earlier. Well, I kind of did with the Kraken witness, but a big part of Bernson and Rodil's activities, along with Byrne, has been getting people out of Venezuela and into the arms of U.S. law enforcement. And then the question is going to become, well, why, how did those deals arise? And what sort of terms and motives were involved in those people getting out? I've already revealed in reporting last year that the Kraken witness, we found out from a court filing that had not been reported before, that Rodil said, I got him out at the request of a billionaire who turns out to have been corrupt, and in Rodil's own words, was brought out to execute a political agenda against one of Maduro's deputies, who, by the way, is right now one of Maduro's co-defendants, Diosdado Cabello, as I mentioned earlier. So if these witnesses are compromised, that potentially compromises the entire Justice Department case and threatens to rip the lid a bit off of exactly how much sourcing the Trump administration, both in intel and law enforcement, have been willing to do from these guys who, as I've reported, if you go check out my work, have let's say questionable records.
That's a good one. That's a good one, because the New York Times did have reporting on these plea deals and the fact that these people are likely to be star witnesses. Look, just taking your piece to its logical conclusion and sort of combining it in an awkward shotgun wedding with what I said a moment ago, I think if things do begin to turn, I have one more prediction here, which is, and I put this in my piece yesterday. Does anybody remember back in October when Trump had a, quote, amazing meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping and announced, we have a trade deal. It's amazing. It's the best deal ever. As of today, there is no deal. And apparently the expectations of the administration that one is ever going to happen are plummeting. It looks like this was just a piece of headline grabbing bullshit, like most other things, although maybe they intended at the time. And the pattern with Trump is sometimes he's serious about something for a minute and then he's done with it. He's moving on. Like, wait, that contractor worked for me? Fuck him. I'm not paying him. I think if, as you say, the legal pieces begin to look shakier, we're going to hear an awful lot less from this administration about drugs and about the role of Venezuela. And one of Drum Krasnow's many tacos. Oh my gosh, Jim, I have to, wow, that's a good, I have to read back and figure out what you're talking about.
Trump always chickens out. Remember?
Oh,
that was the
yes,
Wall Street
Trump always
acronym.
chickens out. I think we're going to hear a lot less about this. It's going to go the way of China, and we will be on to the next crisis, which is probably going to be attacking Greenland. All right.
I mean, given the corporate media's attention span, it's very easy for them to just sort of declare that the drug problem, which didn't exist the way they characterized it in the first place, is now over, which technically true because it never existed. They were not pumping fentanyl on purpose, killing people at the rate of 25,000 Americans per boat. That was never the case. And now if they just say it's not the case now, well, that'll be true.
It's true. See, we found the weapons of mass destruction in those mobile weapons trailers. All right. The Substack is, I mean, there's the one under your name. Substack is so messed up. It's like you have one that's attached to your name, but then you have a publication, and like, which one are you promoting? And it's unclear. The publication is called The Fucking News. You are Jonathan Larsen. People should subscribe to both, to either, whichever you choose to get more on all of this. Jonathan, thanks so much for being on.
Thank you so much for having me, Matt. It's great that you and a growing handful of others are recognizing the importance of getting under the hood of what's going on here. So thank you.
Absolutely. And I hope we've shed some light on this, even if it was obscured at times with interlopers who had very weird agendas, which is basically probably what's also going on with the Venezuela decision. So with that, looking forward to seeing everyone next week. In the meantime, stay safe, be well, see you soon.